On July 3, 1941, fire trucks raced through the city delivering copies of a special edition of the Huntsville Times, announcing that a totally new era was about to begin in North Alabama. Tiny farming communities in the Huntsville area received news that they would soon be affected by profound changes. The Army was coming. Huntsville would never be the same. While the spectacular successes in the more sophisticated field of rockets and guided missiles tend to overshadow its previous accomplishments, the Redstone Arsenal complex established a commendable record in World War II as one of the best equipped, most productive chemical munitions manufacturing centers in the nation. Over 45 million units of ammunition were loaded and assembled for shipment at the Arsenal complex between March 1942 and September 1945, and more than 27 million items of chemical munitions having a total value of over $134.5 million were produced. For their exceptional work, personnel at the Arsenal complex won the prestigious Army-Navy E Award 9 different times for their outstanding record in the production of war equipment. Once World War II ended, the focus shifted from production to the demilitarization and salvaging of munitions and the deactivation of the huge manufacturing facilities at the Arsenal complex. Some of the empty buildings and lands were leased to private enterprise. By 1949, part of the arsenal was advertised for sale, but the sale never happened. A series of events soon transformed these facilities and opened an entirely new chapter to the installation's history. Thanks to the vision and efforts of Major General Holger N. Ludi Toftoy and the shrewd lobbying by Senator John Sparkman, Congressman Bob Jones, and officials from the Huntsville area, Redstone Arsenal's mission had been totally revamped by 1950. It was now the center of Army missilery and rocketry. The new mission included the transfer of Werner von Braun and his team from Fort Bliss, Texas, to Redstone. By 1956, Redstone scientists, engineers, and technicians had transformed such weapons as the Corporal, Honest John, Redstone, Nike Ajax, and Nike Hercules from dreams and plans into realities. As Redstone prospered, so did the city of Huntsville. The period from 1956 to 1960, under the command of Major General John B. Medeiros, was one of the most nationally publicized periods of the Arsenal's history. Frequently, General Medeiros could be seen on national television or testifying before Congress urging funding for his programs. The magnitude of the operations Medeiros managed is reflected in the fact that his command's budget approached $2 billion in fiscal years 1959 and 1960, about 25% of the Army's budget for those years. When Medeiros' team began their work in 1956, they had the primary mission of fielding the Army's first intermediate-range ballistic missile, the Jupiter. By August 1958, the system was delivered to the Air Force for early deployment overseas. The Jupiters later proved to be a significant bargaining chip in the Cuban Missile Crisis. During his command, Medeiros' team also had several other notable achievements in the missile and rocket field as they fielded the Redstone and Hawk, accelerated development of the Nike Zeus system, a predecessor of today's Army Space and Missile Defense Command, and began the development of the Pershing missile system, a system whose improvements would later play a major role in ending the Cold War. It was also during this time that the Army at Redstone made a number of contributions that helped lay the foundation for U.S. space exploration. In August 1957, they recovered intact a nose cone from a Jupiter C flight test, the first time that a man-made object had been retrieved from outer space. However, in October and November of 1957, the Soviets launched Sputniks 1 and 2, shattering American dreams of scientific and technical superiority. Amid mounting public pressure to respond to the Soviet challenge, and due to the repeated problems with the Navy-managed satellite program known as Project Vanguard, the Army was given the green light and successfully launched America's first satellite, Explorer 1, on January 31, 1958, a mere 84 days after receiving the mission. Redstone's facing and meeting this challenge not only restored U.S. prestige, but it also jump-started the extraordinary growth and tradition of excellence that has become a hallmark of both the Redstone and Huntsville communities. Other noteworthy achievements by the Army at Redstone in the space field during this period included launching the first successful American lunar probe and the first U.S. satellite to go into permanent orbit around the Sun, initiating the development of the million-pound thrust engine that became the nation's moon rocket, and recovering the first living beings, monkeys Abel and Baker, from a flight into outer space. The Army's role in the space field began to change dramatically when President Eisenhower concluded that it would be in the nation's best interest to make the von Braun team a part of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. As a result, on July 1, 1960, the Army officially transferred about 4,700 Army civil service employees and more than $100 million in facilities and equipment at Redstone and Cape Canaveral, Florida, to NASA's George C. Marshall Space Flight Center. But it is important to remember that within a year after this transfer, it was an Army-modified Redstone that provided the initial boost for America's first manned spaceflight of Commander Alan B. Shepard on May 5, 1961. An Army-modified Redstone also served as the booster for the Mercury flight of Virgil Gus Grissom in July of that same year. Many soldiers and civilians who come to work at the Army at Redstone Arsenal are astounded when they learn of the significant role that the Army played in paving the way for the U.S. space program. From these roots grew a spirit of achievement, a legacy that has continued even after the Army at Redstone lost its space mission. At the beginning of the 1960s, the Army at Redstone focused on what it had learned to get into space and applying that knowledge to supply our soldiers in the field with the best possible weapons.
There's no place in the world in this decade that is going to play a more significant role than this community right here in the center of Alabama.
By 1962, the U.S. Army was undergoing a sweeping reorganization. One of the results of this reorganization was the creation of the U.S. Army Missile Command, or MICOM, which was activated on August 1, 1962 at Redstone Arsenal. One of the significant changes was the establishment of project managers for missile system programs. During the 1960s and 1970s, much of the technology Redstone Arsenal had been working on began to mature. The Francis J. McMorrow Missile Laboratories were dedicated on March 12, 1964, in memory of MICOM's first commander who died while still in command. These research, development, and engineering facilities established the reputation as being among the best in the Army. Especially noteworthy is their role as a center for laser research. For example, they helped the National Cancer Institute investigate the use of lasers to destroy malignant tumors. And they pioneered the laser guidance concepts and techniques used by the U.S. Air Force in the development of their laser-guided smart bombs. Redstone got a pretty good idea of how well it was doing in June 1967 during the Six-Day War. Israeli troops downed several Egyptian jets with Hawk missiles, marking the first combat firings of U.S. Army missiles. Another significant highlight of this period occurred on May 2, 1972, when the TOW missile mounted on a UH-1B Huey helicopter became the first American-made guided missile to be fired by U.S. troops in combat. In the 1980s, the Army at Redstone began building in great quantities many of the weapons that it had developed in the 1960s and 1970s. One of the best examples would be the Pershing II. First deployed in 1983, this system's increased range and pinpoint accuracy were major factors in influencing the Soviet Union to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty, in 1987, in which the United States and Soviet Union agreed to eliminate an entire class of nuclear missiles. The Pershing had done its job and was retired with honor. In 1991, we got a glimpse of what things were like in the late 1950s as the Army at Redstone stood at the forefront of the news as Desert Storm, Desert Shield operations unfolded. At that time, it was the largest deployment and subsequent combat use of Army missiles in Redstone Arsenal's history. Virtually every one of the Arsenal's missile systems was deployed. Hellfire missiles launched from an Apache helicopter fired the first shots of the war, taking out early warning radars and paving the way for the Air Force's campaign. Hellfire and TOW missiles went on to destroy hundreds of Iraqi tanks, personnel carriers, and other vehicles during the course of the war. MLRS rockets rained down on the Iraqi artillery units and other targets so effectively that the Iraqis referred to them as Steel Rain. And the Scud Buster, better known as the Patriot missile system, became a household word. One of Redstone's strengths has been the excellent relations it has had with the Huntsville community over the years. One example of that cooperative spirit is the amount of land that the Army here has donated to the community to improve the quality of life in the area. Redstone positioned itself for the 21st century when it opened the John J. Sparkman Center in August 1994. This state-of-the-art facility soon became the model for future government construction requirements. A landmark day in the history of Redstone Arsenal occurred on July 17, 1997, when the former Army Missile Command, or MICOM, combined with the aviation portion of the U.S. Army Aviation and Troop Command, or ATCOM. A totally new organization, the U.S. Army Aviation and Missile Command, or AMCOM, was born. The Army had now entrusted Redstone Arsenal with the management of two key components of the Army After Next, missile firepower, and aviation platforms. September 11th, 2001. The world as we knew it would never be the same. As a result, America embarked on its war on terrorism, and Redstone once again was ready to answer the call. For example, we utilized for the first time in operations our Hellfire missiles mounted on a Predator unmanned aerial vehicle. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, we achieved a significant first when the Patriot Advanced Capability 3 defense system, better known as PAC-3, was used for the first time in combat. And our aviation platforms filled the skies, providing protection and delivering troops and equipment. America's sons and daughters will continue to look at us right here at Team Redstone and its depot partners at Corpus Christi and Letterkenny to provide the very best possible equipment to preserve the peace. They do so because they know that the Team Redstone family has always made excellence the cornerstone of their work and support. That tradition of success will continue to make Redstone an enduring installation as we move forward in the 21st century.
On July 3, 1941, fire trucks raced through the city delivering copies of a special edition of the Huntsville Times, announcing that a totally new era was about to begin in North Alabama. Tiny farming communities in the Huntsville area received news that they would soon be affected by profound changes. Names like Pond Beat, Mullins Flat, and Hickory Grove, used locally for generations, would soon disappear. The Army was coming. Huntsville would never be the same. The only remaining pre-Army structure on post is the Harris House, a home that existed in the area of Madison County, Alabama that became Redstone Arsenal. This film is going to take you on a journey that highlights the remarkable history of achievement here at Redstone. The Arsenal does indeed have a very proud past and an even brighter future. On August 4th, 1941, Brigadier General Rollo Ditto, who was a colonel at the time, broke ground for Huntsville Arsenal, whose personnel manufactured chemicals and loaded them into bombs, grenades, and shells. Realizing that it would be extremely economical to locate an ordnance shell loading assembly plant close to the Huntsville Arsenal, the Army's Chief of Ordnance decided to build a facility named Redstone Ordnance Plant, adjacent to Huntsville Arsenal. Ground was broken for the plant on October 25, 1941. The plant was redesignated Redstone Arsenal on February 26, 1943. It manufactured ammunition items and assembled the items loaded at Huntsville Arsenal into complete rounds. Wartime employment totaled nearly 20,000 for both arsenals. The Army and its civilian workforce labored around the clock to meet production schedules. A large portion of the workforce were women and other minorities who worked in the difficult and oftentimes dangerous jobs of loading and manufacturing operations. They did that job extremely well. Today's tradition of excellence had its roots here, for by the war's end, these two arsenals had met or surpassed every goal. They often pioneered production techniques that were adopted elsewhere throughout the Army. Once World War II ended, the enormous payroll disappeared. The focus at both arsenals shifted from production to the demilitarization and salvaging of munitions and the deactivation of these huge manufacturing facilities. The modern-day practice of leasing some of the lands on the arsenal had its origin here. Also, some of the empty buildings were leased to private enterprise, most notably the Keller Motors Corporation. This company actually tried to make the Huntsville area the Detroit of the South. As the 1940s were nearing an end, things looked bleak for both installations. Redstone Arsenal was on standby status, and Huntsville Arsenal was advertised for sale. But events would soon happen that would totally transform these facilities and open an entirely new chapter to the installation's history. When the community celebrated Armed Forces Week in 1985, the Army brought back Redstone Arsenal's first commanding officer, Colonel Carroll D. Hudson, who visited Huntsville for the last time. Major General Jerry Max Bunyard, the commander at that time, presented Colonel Hudson with the baton he had been given by the Golden Knights after their performance. As he stepped away after the presentation, General Bunyard saluted Colonel Hudson. This film is a salute to each of Redstone Arsenal's pioneers. Thanks for a job extremely well done. When Major General Hoger, or as he preferred to be called, Ludi Toftoy, left Redstone in 1958, the citizens of Huntsville and Madison County erected this plaque in his honor here in Big Spring Park. They called him Mr. Missile. When it came to Redstone Arsenal, he was a true visionary. It was Toftoy who recognized the value of bringing Wernher von Braun and his team of German scientists and engineers to the United States as World War II ended. After much persuasion, he was able to bring key members of this team and their equipment to the United States, where they settled at Fort Bliss, Texas. By 1948, Toftoy realized that the management of the Ordnance Corps' rocket activities needed to be decentralized into a field organization. He picked Redstone Arsenal as the home of the Corps' consolidated rocket activities. Redstone came back to life when the Chief of Ordnance officially reactivated it on June 1, 1949. Colonel Hudson returned to lead the arsenal into this new era. After learning that Fort Bliss could not accommodate the new facilities needed for the Army's growing guided missile mission, Ludi Toftoy became the catalyst for relocating the von Braun team to the facilities located at Huntsville Arsenal. Toftoy often told the story of being sent by the Chief of Ordnance to meet with General Matthew Ridgway, the Army Vice Chief of Staff, to try and convince him to permit the move of the Fort Bliss mission to the old Huntsville Arsenal area. Toftoy recalled that his map was so large that he had to spread it across the floor. He soon found that his pointer was not long enough, so he had to crawl around on the map as he pled his case. Finally, Toftoy found himself on his hands and knees right next to General Ridgway. He looked up at the general, gave him a big smile, and said, "I'm really on my hands and knees, literally and figuratively, begging for this place." Thanks to Toftoy's tenacity, and the shrewd lobbying by Senator John Sparkman, Congressman Bob Jones, and officials from the Huntsville area, the Secretary of the Army approved the transfer of the von Braun team on October 28, 1949. By the time they arrived in April 1950, Huntsville Arsenal's land and facilities had been consolidated into Redstone Arsenal. The Army at Redstone thus entered a decade that brought it worldwide acclaim. When Colonel Hudson returned to Redstone in November 1948, the arsenal only had about 250 employees. That number climbed dramatically throughout the decade, totaling more than 16,900 by June 30, 1960. As Redstone grew, so did the city of Huntsville, which had a population of about 16,000 in 1950. By 1960, its population had increased about 350%, totaling more than 72,000. Colonel Hudson increased Redstone's mission even further on March 3, 1952, when he established the Provisional Redstone Ordnance School, the forerunner of today's Ordnance Missile and Munitions Center and School. By 1956, scientists, engineers, and technicians at Redstone had transformed such weapon systems as the Honest John, Little John, Corporal, Sergeant, Redstone, Hawk, Nike Ajax, and Nike Hercules from dreams and plans into realities. Redstone's success with these projects prompted the Army to expand the Arsenal's mission even more by creating the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, or ABMA, on February 1, 1956, under the leadership of Major General John Bruce Medeiros. The von Braun team was assigned to this new agency. Always sharply dressed, sporting his trademark mustache, and with his characteristic swagger stick, Medeiros commanded ABMA and later the Army Ordnance Missile Command, or AOMC, from 1956 to 1960, one of the most nationally publicized periods of the Arsenal's history. A flamboyant leader, Medeiros was granted special powers covering nearly every authority in the development and procurement field. Frequently, he could be seen on national television or testifying before Congress, urging funding for his programs. He did well at this, too, with his budget for fiscal years 1959 and 1960 approaching $2 billion, or about 25% of the Army's budget for those years. When Medeiros' team began their work in 1956, they had the primary mission of fielding the Army's first intermediate-range ballistic missile, which came to be known as the Jupiter. By August 1958, this system was delivered to the Air Force for early deployment overseas. The Jupiters later proved to be a significant bargaining chip in the Cuban Missile Crisis. During his command, Medeiros' team also had several other notable achievements in the missile and rocket field as they fielded the Redstone and Nike Hercules, accelerated the development of the Nike Zeus, which would, a few years later, become a core element of the Nike X Project Office, a predecessor of today's Army Space and Missile Defense Command, and initiated the development of the Red-Eye anti-aircraft system. They also began the development of the Pershing missile system, a system whose improvements would later play a major role in ending the Cold War. However, Medeiros' real legacy was as the godfather of the American space program. This is the Goddard House, which served as a VIP quarters during General Medeiros' tenure. Right behind it once stood an officers' club where Mr. Neil McElroy, Secretary of Defense-elect, dined on October 4, 1957, after an orientation tour of the arsenal. While at dinner, the news came that the Soviets had launched Sputnik 1, the first man-made object into orbit above the Earth. Legend has it that Dr. von Braun asked to be given the green light, and the Army could launch a satellite in 60 days. General Medeiros asked for a little longer, 90 days. About a month later, the Soviet Union announced the launching of a second satellite, Sputnik 2. These Soviet satellites shattered American dreams of scientific and technical superiority. Amid mounting public pressure to respond to this Soviet challenge and repeated problems with the Navy-managed satellite program known as Project Vanguard, the Army was given the go-ahead on November 8, 1957, to prepare a Jupiter C that would launch the first U.S. satellite.
Let's go, Werner.
Just 84 days after receiving the mission, the Army team at Redstone launched Explorer 1 on January 31st, 1958. This team had faced and met the challenge that not only restored U.S. prestige, but also served as the impetus for the extraordinary growth and tradition of excellence that has become a hallmark of both the Redstone and Huntsville communities. As news stories of the Explorer 1's launch began to surface, thousands of people gathered on the courthouse square in Huntsville. Sirens wailed, horns blasted, and the sky filled with store-bought rockets and fireworks, celebrating this country's first step toward the conquest of space. These celebrations were echoed across the nation. However, even before being assigned the Explorer 1 mission, the Army team at Redstone had already recovered intact the nose cone of a Jupiter C it had flight tested on August 8, 1957. This marked the first time that a man-made object had been retrieved from outer space. This recovery also proved the suitability of the nose cone's ablative-type heat protection. But the winds of change were swirling. On July 29, 1958, President Eisenhower signed into law the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. NASA, which was activated on October 1, 1958, by its administrator, Dr. T. Keith Glennon, was given the responsibility of conducting scientific exploration of outer space for peaceful purposes. About a year later, in October 1959, General Medeiros announced that he would be retiring, effective January 31, 1960. One day after Medeiros' announcement, President Eisenhower announced that he had concluded that the von Braun team could, quote, best serve the national interest as an integral part of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Before the von Braun team's transfer to NASA, the Army at Redstone had several other noteworthy achievements in laying the foundation for U.S. space exploration. Some of these included launching the first successful American lunar probe and the first U.S. satellite to go into permanent orbit around the Sun, initiating the development of the million-pound thrust engine that became the nation's moon rocket, and recovering the first living beings, monkeys Abel and Baker, from a flight into outer space. This recovery paved the way for putting the first man into orbit. On July 1, 1960, Major General August Schoenberg commented that he felt like the father of the bride as he officially transferred about 4,700 Army Civil Service employees and more than $100 million in facilities and equipment at Redstone and Cape Canaveral, Florida, to Dr. von Braun, the new director of NASA's George C. Marshall Space Flight Center. Yet, it is important to remember that within a year after the transfer, May 5, 1961, it was an Army-modified Redstone that provided the initial boost for America's first manned space flight of Commander Alan B. Shepard. An Army-modified Redstone also served as the booster for the Mercury flight of Virgil Grissom in July of that same year. Thus, the first American manned space flights were based solidly on Army contributions. Many soldiers and civilians who today come to work for the Army at Redstone Arsenal are amazed when they learn of the significant role that the Army played in paving the way for the U.S. space program. From these roots grew a spirit of achievement, a legacy that has continued even after the Army at Redstone lost its space mission. Never at a loss for words, Medeiros was asked to speak to the Huntsville Chamber of Commerce on January 31, 1978, to help commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Explorer 1 launch. By then a priest, Medeiros noted, "I do choose to remind the historians of Huntsville that the Army led the city from cotton and watercress to become the space capital of the United States." At the beginning of the 1960s, the Army at Redstone focused on using what it had learned to get into space and applying that knowledge to supply our soldiers in the field with the best possible weapons. So began the third phase of Redstone Arsenal's remarkable history. By 1962, the Army was undergoing a sweeping reorganization. One of the results of this reorganization was the creation of the U.S. Army Materiel Command, or AMC. One of AMC's major subordinate commands was the U.S. Army Missile Command. MICOM, as it was commonly called, was activated on August 1, 1962, under the command of Major General Francis McMorrow. Building 5250 stood as the command headquarters building for the next 32 years. One of the significant changes was the establishment of project managers for missile system programs. Systems initially singled out for project management included the Nike Hercules, Pershing, Sergeant, Lance, and Hawk. During the 1960s and 70s, much of the technology the Arsenal had been working on began to mature. Redstone added a number of project offices during this time. Some of these included TOW, Dragon, Stinger, Hellfire, Chaparral FAR, the General Support Rocket System, or MLRS as it came to be called, and the Patriot. It was also during this period, in May 1974, that all ballistic missile defense efforts were consolidated under a single manager in the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization, which eventually evolved into today's U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Command. Redstone got a pretty good idea of how well it was doing in June 1967 during the Six-Day War. Israeli troops downed several Egyptian jets with Hawk missiles, marking the first combat firings of U.S. Army missiles. The TOW missile, mounted on a UH-1B Huey, became the first American-made guided missile to be fired by U.S. troops in combat. These first combat firings of the airborne TOW occurred on May 2, 1972. Serving in Vietnam until January 1973, the airborne TOW compiled an impressive record. The Arsenal dedicated the Francis J. McMorrow Missile Laboratories on March 12, 1964, in memory of General McMorrow, who died while still in command. The research, development, and engineering facilities here have the reputation for being among the best in the Army. They have consistently forged advancements in technology to meet both current and future Army materiel requirements. McMorrow Labs has been an important center for laser research. Redstone scientists and engineers even helped the National Cancer Institute investigate the use of lasers to destroy malignant tumors. They also pioneered the laser guidance concepts and techniques used by the Air Force in the development of their laser-guided smart bombs, which were used so effectively during Desert Storm. In the 1980s, the Army began building in great quantities many of the weapons that Redstone Arsenal had developed in the 1960s and 70s. One of the best examples would be the Pershing II. First deployed in 1983, this system's increased range and pinpoint accuracy were major factors in influencing the Soviet Union to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987. The Pershing had done its job and was retired with honor. It was appropriate that on a hot Alabama day, July 16, 1988, the seemingly unthinkable happened. A team of Soviet inspectors came to Redstone Arsenal to inspect Pershing facilities. The Cold War was melting away. 1991, Desert Shield Desert Storm operations unfolded. This was the largest deployment and subsequent combat use of missiles in Army history. Virtually every one of Redstone's missile systems was deployed. In fact, Hellfire missiles launched from Apache helicopters fired the first shots of the war, taking out early warning radars and paving the way for the Air Force air war. The Hellfire and TOW missiles went on to destroy hundreds of Iraqi tanks, personnel carriers, and other vehicles during the course of the war. MLRS rockets rained down on the Iraqi artillery units and other targets so effectively that the Iraqis referred to it as Steel Rain. And who can ever forget the Patriot, or the Scud Buster as it came to be called? Once again, the Army at Redstone had risen to the challenge. After the war ended, Huntsville had a Celebration of Patriots parade.
Join us for the Celebration of Patriots parade on June 11th.
As part of the community's Armed Forces Week activities to welcome home all of its Gulf War heroes. The Army team at Redstone had clearly proven that when we were needed, we were there.
We were there. We were
The 1990s saw Redstone Arsenal embarking on the fourth chapter of its proud history. The installation had fully adapted to a whole new means of executing the project management programs. After the Gulf War ended, Redstone began positioning itself to answer the call as the Army prepared to restructure its force and consolidate its activities. One of Redstone's strengths has been the excellent relations it has had with the Huntsville community over the years. One example of that cooperative spirit is the amount of land that the Army here has donated to the local community and the state to improve the quality of life in this area. Examples of the more than 880 acres of donated land include such sites as the U.S. Space and Rocket Center and the adjacent hotel, Morris Elementary School, the Huntsville Botanical Garden, recreational facilities, and a Naval Reserve Center. Redstone's potential for growth was further enhanced by the fact that it had won a number of Army Communities of Excellence awards in the early 1990s. This was a direct result of Redstone's total commitment to providing outstanding, world-class customer service. For a time in the early 1990s, Redstone officials and community leaders could be seen making numerous trips back and forth to Rock Island, Illinois, urging the workers there to consider moving to Huntsville should a proposed merger of their facilities with those of Redstone take place. While that move never materialized, Redstone continued positioning itself for the 21st century when it dedicated the John J. Sparkman Center in August 1994. When it opened, this $67 million state-of-the-art facility consisted of over 680,000 square feet. It soon became a model for future government construction requirements. Expansion over the next few years increased its capacity to over 990,000 square feet. July 17, 1997, though only a short time ago, was a landmark in Redstone Arsenal's history. On that day, the former Army Missile Command combined with the aviation portion of the U.S. Army Aviation and Troop Command. A new organization, the U.S. Army Aviation and Missile Command, or AMCOM, was born. The Army had now entrusted Redstone Arsenal with the management of two key components of the Army after next: missile firepower and aviation platforms. The greatest resource of Redstone has always been its people, starting with those who labored on the production lines here back during World War II. The people of Redstone have made excellence the cornerstone of their work. That tradition of success will continue to make Redstone an enduring installation as we move forward in the 21st century.
Four, three, two, one. Booster ignition and liftoff.
A lot of people try to tell the story of NASA without telling the story of the Army, and that's a grave mistake. The Army was the foundation for NASA here in Huntsville, and you just can't tell one story without telling the other. That's the beginning of the story.
There's two things in my mind, that two events that gave birth to Redstone Arsenal. If you got to have a mama and a papa, here they are. One of them was Toftoy bringing that contingent here. The second thing was Sputnik.
When Germany collapses, Dr. von Braun and key V2 scientists decide to surrender to the Americans. Far-sighted Army officers who have planned for such an opportunity seize the initiative.
The American officer on the spot was Major General Holger N. Toftoy, then a colonel in charge of Ordnance Technical Intelligence in Europe, and now commanding general of the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. You had to act fast, General Toftoy. What did you do?
Our intelligence sources had told us of the role Dr. von Braun and his Army Superior, General Dornberger, had played in the development of the V-2 program. I believe that the brains of these men, if we could find them, must be put to work on behalf of the United States. After all, they were the world's only experienced missile team. The United States had much to learn about rocketry, and these men, dedicated and experienced, made very fine teachers.
This is your life.
I remember how you left for the United States shortly thereafter to convince the Army that it was important that some of us be brought to America to work on rocket development, and how on your return to Germany, with this approval, you and I sat together and choose the, I think, 127 of us who were to come to the United States.
We wanted 300, remember?
I remember very well.
The deadly V-2 rocket bomb is assembled by U.S. engineers for testing. Rivaling the atom bomb in importance, the 46 feet of death and destruction is set in place by an ingenious elevating boom at White Sands Proving Ground near Las Cruces, New Mexico. Parts to make up 100 V-2s were brought from Germany, and Proving Ground officers are carrying on experiments involving war and peace usage.
In April 1950, the Army's rocket experts were moved to the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. And thereafter, Redstone becomes the chief center for rocket and guided missile research.
In July of 1950, American rocket pioneers launch Bumper, a captured German V-2 with an Army-developed second stage. Thoughts of space travel, kept alive among members of the team at Redstone, are temporarily set aside in 1951 when the Army directs them to begin work on an advanced design ballistic missile with a 200-mile range. First called Major, later renamed Redstone. Expansion of the team and build-up of facilities coincide with radical advances in missile structure, propulsion, and control.
General Toftoy was then put in charge of the Rocket Research and Development Division of the Army, wasn't he, Dr. von Braun?
Yes, under his direction, the Army-guided missile program actually came to maturity. There was the development of the Corporal and the Nike and the Honest John and the Redstone and other missiles. And I think I can state that without your foresight and determination, General Toftoy, particularly in those 7 lean years between 1945 and 1952, the United States would not be as advanced as we are today in our missile program.
Von Braun was convinced that he would be the first one to launch a satellite in this country. The possibility to do that came in the early 50s. Around 1952, he asked me to look for a scientist who could put his first-rate scientific instrument on board of our satellite to make it useful for science. I was happy about this assignment because I knew exactly whom I would like to choose. It would be Dr. Van Allen.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
It takes 2 years to bring Redstone to life. But the day comes when the proud parents can relax and smile, if only for a few moments, while the baby howls for the first time. Incorporating a self-contained guidance system of the type pioneered in the V-2 and a novel scheme of separating the explosive package from the rocket engine at the end of powered flight, the Redstone is America's first large ballistic missile. A weapon of war, it is destined for a place in history as the Model T of the free world's space age. Flight tests begin in August 1953.
And let me add that without your kind heart all of us whom you brought to this country would not be citizens of the United States today.
Thank you, Dr. Werner von Braun.
In Washington, the Stewart Committee was established to study how America should produce and launch a satellite as part of its contribution to the International Geophysical Year, or IGY as it was called. The committee reviewed all the possibilities, and eventually 2 proposals emerged. One was from the Army's Redstone Arsenal, submitted by the von Braun Group.
By September 1954, the Army team realizes that the Redstone is ready for an assignment in space. Dr. von Braun proposes that it be used as the first stage of a rocket vehicle to orbit an Earth satellite. Eventually, this Army proposal evolves into Project Orbiter, a joint Army-Navy undertaking which combines the Redstone and other Army rockets into a composite satellite launching vehicle.
The other proposal was from the Naval Research Lab, or NRL. It was based on the as-yet undeveloped rocket named Vanguard.
An instrument-crammed 20-inch sphere that will communicate with Earth. To carry the man-made moon to its orbit, a 3-stage rocket is required, a 72-footer that will reach 5 miles a second. It will be launched from Patrick Air Force Base, Florida. The burned-out first stage drops into the Caribbean. Above the atmosphere, the nose cone is shed. Then the second stage is dropped, height 140 miles. A chain of radar stations tracks the flight. When the third stage cuts in, the speed reaches 18,000 miles an hour. Telescopic cameras will be trained in readiness for the moment the satellite is freed. Its momentum balanced against the pull of gravity to hold it in orbit. Every second it will broadcast data never before obtainable. Computers will predict its path, with ground observers checking for variations that will give new facts about every shape of our Earth. That is how man will take his first stride into space and put a new moon in the sky.
We in Huntsville had known Homer Stewart for some time, and we were always on very good terms together. We also knew that Homer Stewart would favor the satellite built jointly by JPL and Huntsville over the other proposal that was proposed by the Navy, the Vanguard.
The untested Vanguard was chosen on the grounds that the satellite should not be launched by a military rocket like the Jupiter C, but rather by a purely scientific device, since it was to celebrate a United Nations event.
Meanwhile, I was in close touch with my former colleague at White Sands, Dr. Ernst Stuhlinger, and at a meeting in 1954 in Princeton, New Jersey, where I was at the time, he advised me on the state of development of an alternative launch vehicle which involved the Redstone missile as a first stage. And so at that point in time, it appealed to me that the sensible thing for us to do here at the University of Iowa was to design our apparatus such that it would be suitable for either a Vanguard or a Army ballistic missile satellite system. So that was one of the best decisions I ever made, I think, but we went ahead as of 1954 on that point of view.
July 1st marks the beginning of one of the great scientific adventures of our time, the International Geophysical Year.
Newsrooms around the world get the sudden announcement that the United States will have a purely scientific satellite program, Project Vanguard. Project Orbiter is canceled.
It was Eisenhower's decision that he wanted to keep this thing completely out of the hands of the military, because he didn't want to interfere with the development of the ICBM, which was a legitimate argument. On the other hand, we did not think that NRL's experience with rockets was such that they could easily do this. We predicted troubles.
Horner, do you have any more questions?
Doctor, just how far, within the classification of this conference, of course, how far do you think that the Russians or other nations of the world have gotten in this space travel?
Well, it looks like the Russians are very well aware of the capabilities
I believe they are working hard at it, and I still hope that we'll be first up there, of course, but I think we have no time to lose if we want to be first in an orbit.
After consulting with the scientists, our artists and studio technicians have prepared a factual picture of how the coming conquest of the moon will be accomplished.
A voyage around the moon must be made in 2 phases. A rocket ship taking off from the Earth's surface will use almost all the fuel it can carry just to attain a speed great enough to balance the pull of gravity. A passenger rocket, 1,075 miles above the Earth, will guide each of the 12 approaching cargo rockets to their rendezvous in the orbit.
February 1956. The Army activates ABMA, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, at Redstone Arsenal. Major General John B. Medeiros arrives to take command. He gets extraordinary powers and priorities to expedite the big missiles, now deemed vital to free world defense. 2 ABMA are assigned responsibility for the Redstone and the 1,500-mile Jupiter missile, the experienced civilian military team, and all facilities necessary to move missiles from conception to reality. It is an organization and a capability unique in the free world. This cluster of solid propellant rockets perched atop a Redstone missile turns it into a Jupiter C vehicle, the satellite launcher first proposed by the Army 2 years earlier in 1954.
Armed Forces Day at Selfridge Air Force Base, Michigan draws a large crowd of visitors who find an Army Globemaster a point of attraction. But the real guest of honor is the Chrysler-built Redstone guided missile, one of the newest in the arsenal of the atomic age.
The Soviets were not secretive about their intention to create Earth satellites. With increasing frankness, they discussed their plans with anyone willing to listen or read. And Premier Khrushchev himself, in August 1956, officially announced the Soviet development of an intercontinental ballistic missile with a range of 5,000 miles.
Assembled to test Jupiter missile parts, America's first rocket vehicle capable of orbiting a satellite is completely successful.
Yes, we could have loaded that last stage and put something into orbit, certainly in 1956. Instead of that, we did the re-entry test program for them. And so we had the capability that we could have been first.
It lofts this fully instrumented payload to new height and distance records, more than 600 miles above the Earth and 3,000 miles from the launch site. The Army has the know-how and the carrier rocket with which to orbit satellites.
Medeiros, on at least one occasion, said, I don't want to discover that you people accidentally loaded that last stage and went into orbit, because we're not allowed to do that. And in fact, of course, that the final Explorer design was essentially that same system.
Just outside Detroit is located one of the country's most strategic missiles plants, and for the first time, the Department of Defense has permitted public view of the production of one of the most effective weapons. Here you see the famed Redstone on the assembly line. The missile is put together in 4 sections and measures 70 feet in length when assembled. The rapid production of Redstone is one of the answers to criticism leveled at the government for the lag in the missiles program. Although the range of Redstone is still an official secret, it is believed to be upwards of 500 miles. And here is Redstone in action.
Knowing the odds were high against the Vanguard's success, General James C. Gavin, Army Chief of Research and Development, Generals Toftoy and Medeiros, Doctors von Braun and Pickering, and many others, kept begging for permission to launch the satellite with the Jupiter C immediately. They were fearful the Russians would launch theirs any day. Each time they asked, they were turned down.
The Army makes repeated offers to orbit satellites using spare Jupiter-C vehicles in support of Project Vanguard, but to no avail. General Medeiros is later to testify in congressional hearings. In various languages, our fingers were slapped and we were told to mind our own business.
The Jupiter Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile achieved a historic milestone May 31, 1957, when it became the first IRBM to be successfully fired to a range of 1,500 miles.
Project Vanguard, which will set an artificial satellite in space circling the Earth, is revealed at the Martin Aircraft Plant in Baltimore. A full-scale model of the 21-inch moon and a model of the Vanguard rocket, the 20,000-ton three-stage missile that will carry the satellite to its orbit, where it will broadcast priceless scientific data to Earth. The first glimpses ever permitted of the Vanguard assembly line show the mighty rockets nearing completion. Soon the first will be test fired, while the actual satellite launching is scheduled before the end of 1958. A daring first stride into outer space.
By the summer of 1957, it was clear that the Vanguard program was behind schedule. It was also pretty clear that the Russians were doing very well.
Then, on July 29, 1957, this order went out to the armed services. Recent news stories which have described certain projects as space flight projects have resulted in unfavorable reaction at Department of Defense and congressional levels. In any speeches or public releases planned by you or your staff, avoid the mention or the discussion of space, space technology, and space vehicles.
The date is August 8, 1957. The time, 01:58 hours. Poised on the launching pad at Cape Canaveral, Florida, and with its nose cone spinning, Jupiter-C is prepared for firing. This successfully launched Jupiter-C followed its prescribed trajectory all the way to its target. A Navy vessel stands by. A Navy Frogman team from the recovery vessel has secured a line to the Jupiter-C's nose cone. Aided by a deck crew from the recovery vessel, a heavy line hauls up the submerged nose cone that conquered the critical re-entry problem of returning to the Earth's atmosphere. Although the nose cone of the Jupiter-C missile plunged through the Earth's atmosphere with the speed and heat intensity of a meteorite, it suffered little or no damage.
And so, by the summer of 1957, space had become a forbidden word in Washington.
So I was convinced around that time in September 57 that a Russian satellite launch would be imminent. So I went to our commanding general in Huntsville, General Medeiros, and asked him whether he would not be considering and ask for permission for us to launch a satellite. General Medeiros did not quite share my concern. Relax, he said to me, go back to your laboratory. I was very disappointed about this, but I could not do anything more.
In Washington, the space program was bogged down in frustration. But in the Soviet Union...
Just shortly before their launching on October 4th, which happened to be a Friday, on the Monday of that week, a one-week-long International Geophysical Year meeting was held in Washington, D.C. And on the Monday, people from the various countries gave reports on what they were doing, and Blagonravov gave the Russian report, which said that the launching of the satellite would be in the near future. The man who was sitting next to me turned and said he didn't say that. He said the launching was imminent. And at least that's how he translated it.
Less than 1 week after my talk to Medeiros, Sputnik was in orbit. Von Braun asked me then, well, I think Medeiros owes you an apology. Did he talk to you since that? And I said, yes, he did. But all what he said was, those damn bastards. During that time in October 1957, when Sputnik was launched, there happened to be a meeting in Huntsville between the Huntsville people, the Secretary of Defense designate, McElroy. They had a cocktail evening. While we were sitting together, joking and having a good time, all of a sudden our public affairs officer, Gordon Harris, came into the room with his arms up and he said, the Russians have launched a satellite. That was, of course, like a bomb shell exploding in the middle. At first, nobody could say anything. And then von Braun, he said to McElroy, who was sitting next to him, Mr. Secretary, if I had been given the word, we could have done that a year ago.
On a Friday evening, the end of the meeting, the Soviets announced that they would have a cocktail party at the embassy. And in the middle of that cocktail party, Walter Sullivan walked in. He spotted me and asked me what they had said about the satellite. And I said, what satellite? And he told me that his paper had sent him down there on the because Radio Moscow had stated that there was a satellite in orbit. So I got Lloyd Berkner, who was the senior U.S. scientist present, and we huddled in the corner. And then Lloyd said, I'll handle this. And he went over and talked to Blank-Ravov and said he wanted to propose a toast. And Lloyd proposed a toast to the Soviet satellite. And I don't think the Russians were playing games. I think that the first report of that satellite came from the New York Times and not through the Russian circuits.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York earlier today. Right now, it's over Auckland, New Zealand. According to the latest Soviet announcement, the satellite is still maintaining its speed of 18,000 miles an hour, meeting no resistance 560 miles out in space. The Russians say it'll be joined by another very shortly, and there will be advanced